Two men, separated by 17 centuries, never met, never read each other's words, followed completely different spiritual paths. They described the exact same transformation of consciousness. One called it Fana, annihilation. The other called it Nibbana, extinction. The Buddha taught in the Anguttara Nikaya, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one becomes dispassionate toward suffering. This is the path to purification. Rumi wrote, "I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as a plant and rose to animal. I died as an animal and I was human. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying?" 1. A Persian mystic dancing in ecstatic union with the divine. The other, a seeker who found awakening beneath a tree in ancient India. One worshipped Allah as ultimate reality. The other questioned whether gods could escape samsara at all. Both described the annihilation of ego, the dissolution of self, the death that leads to liberation. This isn't a story claiming all religions teach the same thing. Buddhism and Sufism make incompatible truth claims, but they describe strikingly convergent experiences of consciousness transformation. Understanding why reveals something profound about the human mind. November 1244, Konya Marketplace. A 37-year-old Islamic law professor is teaching students when a wild-eyed dervish approaches. "What is the purpose of all your learning?" Shams of Tabriz demands. Rumi's answer is eloquent, scholarly, perfect. Shams laughs. That's not it at all. Something in those words breaks Rumi. Physically breaks him. He drops his books right there in the marketplace and stumbles home. His students find him 3 days later, weeping, rocking, muttering poetry he can't control. He can't teach, won't eat, just spins and weeps. His wife thinks he's dying. He is dying. The Rumi who was a law professor, dead. Something else is being born. He's experiencing Fana, the Sufi annihilation of self. 17 centuries earlier, around 528 BCE, Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath a Bodhi tree and experienced something he would spend the next 45 years trying to describe. Nibbana, the extinguishing of craving, aversion, delusion. Two men, two teachings. The Buddha's path, anattā, not self. The recognition that what we call I cannot be found in form, feeling, perception, mental formations, or consciousness. Rumi's path, Fana, the dissolution of separate self into divine unity. One investigated ultimate reality through systematic observation, the other through overwhelming devotion. One taught paticca samuppada, a dependent origination, a natural law requiring no creator. The other sang poems celebrating God as source and destination of all existence. These are fundamental metaphysical divide, so what explains the convergent experiences both described? Ego death, non-dual awareness, profound peace beyond words. To understand these parallel, we need to examine what both meant by the death of self. Imagine Preikestolen in Norway, 1,982 feet straight down. Wind screaming, your legs shaking. Every cell in your body screaming, step back. Both the Buddha and Rumi said, jump. Not physically, psychologically. Let go of everything you think you are. Die while you're still alive. The question is, what exactly dies when you jump? The Buddhist framework first. Nibbana in Pali literally means extinguishing or blowing out. The Dhammapada verse 203, hunger is the worst disease, Conditioned things are the worst suffering. Knowing this as it truly is, Nibbana is the supreme happiness. But what gets extinguished? Not consciousness itself. Three fires: raga, greed, grasping after pleasant experience; dosa, hatred, pushing away unpleasant experience; moha, delusion, fundamental misunderstanding of reality. These three fires keep samsara turning. When they're extinguished, suffering ceases. When asked, "Where does an enlightened one go after death?" the Buddha responded, "When a fire goes out, which direction does it go?" The question doesn't apply, the fire simply goes out. The Anattā Sutta, the Buddha's second sermon, lays it out. The five khandhas: rupa, form; vedana, feeling; sanya, perception; sankhara, mental formations; vijnana, consciousness. If you remember our five aggregates video, this is exactly what the Buddha meant by dismantling the illusion of I am. Can any of these be identified as self? If they were truly yours, you could command them. Don't age, don't hurt, stay pleasant. But you can't. Everything you call me is process, arising dependent on conditions, impermanent, beyond control. The conclusion: this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Nibbana is what's discovered when you see through this illusion completely. There was never a permanent, independent self to begin with. Now the Sufi teaching. Fana, from Arabic, to pass away, to cease to exist. The Sufi path unfolds in three stages, first dissolving into the teacher, then into the prophet, finally into God himself. Not all Sufi orders agree on these exact stages, but all agree the ego must dissolve. Rumi wrote, "You are not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop." The self, Sufis teach, was always illusion created by perceived separation from divine source. Liberation comes through realizing you were never separate. The wave discovers it was always ocean. Following Fana comes baka, subsistence. The mystic remains in God without illusion of separate existence. The metaphysical divide is absolute. Sufism, the self dissolves into divine unity. Buddhism, the illusion of self is seen through revealing it never existed as conceived. Sufism describes merger. Buddhism describes collapse of mistaken view. Still, both report remarkably similar experiences. Ego death, loss of subject-object duality, profound peace, transformation that cannot be reversed. You've spent your entire life building an identity, your name, history, your preferences, beliefs, role in society, defending it, refining it, updating it. This identity feels more real than anything else. Both Buddhism and Sufism say this construction is the source of your suffering. The Buddha's route: investigate this self systematically through meditation until you cannot find it anywhere in the five aggregates. Watch breath, observe sensations, notice feelings arise and pass, see thoughts come and go. Eventually the question who is watching collapses. Just watching happening, no watcher. Rumi's root: love God so completely the lover disappears into love itself. Practice dhikr until the one remembering and the one remembered merge. Spin in sama until dancer and dance become one. You cannot get rid of the self because the one trying to get rid of it is the illusion. You can only see through it, whether through insight as Buddhism teaches or surrender as Sufism teaches. The Buddha sat under a tree and reported, "The self I was searching for, I cannot find anywhere." Rumi spun until he collapsed and wrote, "I looked for myself and could only find you." Different words, same discovery. The self you think you are doesn't exist anywhere you look for it. So if the experiences converge, how do the practices compare? Because the methods completely opposite. Picture two rooms. In the first, a Sufi dervish spins in white robes, arms spread wide, head tilted, music pulsing, sweat pouring, crying, Allah, 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 until words dissolve into sound. In the second, a Buddhist monk sits cross-legged, spine straight, eyes half closed, breath barely moving, silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. Both report arriving at the same shore, but the journey's completely opposite. The Buddha taught systematically. The Satipatthana Sutta outlines 4 foundations of mindfulness. Kayanupassana, observing body, breath, postures, sensations. Vedananupassana, observing pleasant, unpleasant, neutral feelings without reaction. Cittanupassana, observing mind with greed, without greed, with aversion, without aversion. Dhammanupassana, observing mental objects, the 5 hindrances, aggregates, sense bases, factors of enlightenment. Simple, but not easy. Continuous awareness, observing reality as it arises and passes. The Buddha also taught jhana, 8 progressive absorptions. The first jhana feels like this. Your mind, usually scattered across 1,000 thoughts, suddenly focuses like a laser. Thoughts still arise, but clear now. Sharp. Then something unexpected. PT. Rapture. Not emotional happiness. Physical. Your body fills with energy. Waves of pleasure rolling through. Not sought. Not created. Just arising. The jhanas unfold in 8 progressively deeper layers of stillness, each one quieter, more refined, until even perception itself begins to dissolve. The Anapanasati Sutta outlines 16 steps of breath meditation. Beginning, simple awareness of in-breath and out-breath. Middle, awareness of entire body, calming bodily formations. Advanced, observing impermanence in each breath, fading away. Cessation, relinquishment. The emphasis throughout, sati, mindfulness, not trance, not obliteration, clear seeing of reality as it is, yathabhatam. Sufism takes the opposite approach. Instead of reducing stimulation, amplify it. Instead of stillness, movement. Instead of silence, sound and music. The whirling ceremony, sema, black cloak symbolizing the tomb of ego, removed to reveal white robe beneath. The dervish spins, right hand to heaven receiving grace, left hand to earth transmitting it. First revolution, dizziness. 20th, the body moves without intention. 50th, no dervish, no room, only spinning itself. The ney flute pierces through, the one watching dissolves into the spinning. Music in Islam is controversial. Many Orthodox scholars forbid it, but Sufis argued music is prayer, sound bypassing rational mind, rhythm entraining consciousness, melody opening heart. Dhikr is the core practice, remembrance of God. La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, repeated thousands of times. In many Sufi orders, including some Naqshbandi lineages, a practitioner might sit for morning dhikr, repeating La ilaha illallah 5,000 times. First 1,000, the tongue speaks it. Second 1,000, the breath carries it. Third 1,000, the heart remembers it. 4,000, the words dissolve. 5th 1,000, only God remains. In many modern renderings of Rumi's poetry, we find this ecstatic call. Dance when you're broken open. Dance when you've torn the bandage off. Dance in the middle of fighting. Dance in your blood. Dance when you're perfectly free. Rumi consistently used intoxication imagery to express ego loss. The method is intensity, overwhelming ordinary consciousness until it collapses. Buddhism. Remove the noise. Stabilize your attention. Watch the mind. See impermanence. Release. Sufism. Amplify everything. Overwhelm the ordinary mind. Dissolve into the divine. Annihilate the self. One starves the fire. One feeds it until it consumes everything. When a Buddhist master teaches anapanasati, the student observes breath thousands of times. Eventually, the separation between observer and observed blurs. Just breathing happening, no one doing it. Processes arising and passing, that's all. When a Sufi master teaches dhikr, repetition continues until words lose semantic meaning. The speaker and spoken merge. Only the act of remembrance remains, then even that dissolves. Zen Buddhism adds another dimension closer to Sufi approach. The sixth patriarch Huineng taught sudden enlightenment, not gradual purification. Instantaneous recognition. Zen master Hakuin gave this koan to a monk. You know the sound of two hands clapping. What is the sound of one hand? The monk tries logic, fails, tries philosophy, fails, tries for months. Nothing works. One day, walking past a market, he hears a vendor's cry. Suddenly, something breaks. He runs to Hakuin laughing. Hakuin asks, "So?" The monk claps with one hand. Hakuin nods. The monk got it, not the answer, but the dissolution of the question itself. Rumi. The wound is where the light enters you. Zen. Great doubt, great awakening. Small doubt, small awakening. Both recognize sometimes the conceptual mind must be shattered, not gently dissolved. 10,000 hours of sitting, 10,000 turns of spinning. Both at some point report the same impossible thing. I disappeared, but awareness remained. Who was aware? No answer, because the one who would answer is gone. Different methods, same discovery. Human consciousness pushed to its limits reveals what's been hidden underneath the constructed self all along. But there's a tension we cannot ignore. Sufis fall in love with God. Buddhist teaching fundamentally questions the entire concept of a creator deity. How do you reconcile divine love with divine absence? Rumi said, I have put duality away. I have seen the two worlds as one. One I seek, one I know, one I see, one I call. The Buddha said, when this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. One found unity in a divine beloved. One found it in a natural law of causation with no first cause, no creator. This is a fundamental metaphysical divide. The Brahmajala Sutta records the Buddha encountering Brahma, the creator god in Hindu cosmology. Brahma claims, eternal, all-powerful creator of all beings. The Buddha's response, Brahma is mistaken. He's simply a deva, a celestial being with extremely long lifespan, billions of years. He woke up first in this world cycle, saw other beings appearing, mistakenly concluded he'd created them. But he didn't. He's still trapped in samsara, still subject to rebirth, still unenlightened. A monk once asked the Buddha, what happens to the enlightened one after death? Do they exist? Not exist? Both? Neither? The Buddha picked up a stick, snapped it in half, threw both pieces into the fire, then walked away. The monk stood watching the sticks burn, no answer, just flames consuming wood. When the fire went out, which direction did it go? This isn't atheism exactly. Gods exist in Buddhist cosmology. Devas in various heavenly realms, Brahmas in even higher realms. But they aren't ultimate, didn't create anything, cannot grant liberation, subject to impermanence like everything else. The Buddha placed enlightenment above even the highest gods. The Buddha's core insight, paticcasamuppada, dependent origination. Everything arises dependent on conditions. Nothing has independent, inherent existence. No first cause. No creator standing outside the system. The 12 links: ignorance conditions mental formations. Formations condition consciousness. Consciousness conditions name and form. And so on, through aging and death. The cycle is perpetual until broken through insight. As stated in the Majjhima Nikaya, whoever sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma, whoever sees the Dhamma sees me. If you've seen our video on dependent origination, you know this teaching reveals how suffering arises through clinging. When you see this directly, not intellectually, clinging ceases. When clinging ceases, suffering ceases. The Anattā Sutta again. Liberation comes through direct perception that form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, all not self. No merger, no union. Simply seeing the truth that was always there. The constructed self was never real to begin with. Mahayana Buddhism adds one crucial concept, shunyata, emptiness. Not nothingness, but the absence of independent existence. Everything exists only dependently, relationally, conditionally. The Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Sufism centers on ishq, divine love, as path and destination. God is beloved, mahbub. The seeker is lover. Ashik, separation. Hijr, as painful state. Union, wisal, as goal. Rumi said, "Love is the bridge between you and everything." The universe exists because God desired to be known. A hadith Qudsi states, "I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. So I created the creation that I might be known." Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, central to all Islam, but Sufis push this to mystical extremes. Ibn Arabi taught wahdat al-wujud, unity of being. Ultimately, only God exists. Everything else is manifestation. Tajalli, divine self-disclosure. Ibn Arabi, there is nothing in existence except God. Sounds pantheistic. Islamic scholars debate this intensely. Some accused Ibn Arabi of heresy, but the Sufi view, you don't become God, you realize you were never separate. Here Mahayana and Sufism converge. Ibn Arabi, only God truly exists, everything else appearance. Nagarjuna, nothing has independent existence, everything interdependent. Not identical theologically, but both say reality isn't what ordinary perception suggests. The separate self is illusion. Al-Ghazali, who lived from 1058 to 1111 CE, bridged Orthodox Islam and Sufi mysticism. A philosopher, theologian, jurist who had spiritual crisis midlife, abandoned prestigious teaching in Baghdad, wandered as Sufi for 11 years. He wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, then Revival of Religious Sciences, integrating Sufi experience with Islamic law. His argument, direct experience of God, marifa, surpasses intellectual knowledge. Philosophy can only take you so far. Direct tasting, dhawq, is required. Another Sufi, al-Hallaj, pushed even further. He proclaimed Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, or I am God. Executed for this claim in 922 CE. Orthodox Islam saw blasphemy. Sufis saw complete annihilation of ego, only God remaining. The Buddha warned of a similar trap. The belief I am enlightened proves you're not. True realization leaves no one to claim it. Different frameworks, similar recognition that ego claims about ultimate attainment are contradictory. The metaphysical claims are incompatible. Sufism, God exists, God is ultimate reality. God created everything. Liberation is union with God. Buddhism, no creator God. Ultimate reality is the interdependent nature of phenomena, their emptiness of inherent existence. Nothing was created. Everything arises dependent on conditions. Liberation is seen through illusion. Despite this, after Fana, Sufi practitioners report, no separate self remains. Dualistic perception ceases. Subject-object distinction collapses. Profound peace beyond description. After directly perceiving anattā and nibbāna, Buddhist practitioners report not self directly seen, subject-object duality recognized as constructed, profound peace beyond description. Where Sufism speaks of merging with the beloved, Buddhism speaks of dissolving the illusion of the one who seeks to merge. The languages differ. The transformation feels remarkably similar. Rumi points to absolute unity and calls it Allah. Nagarjuna points to emptiness and refuses to call it anything. Rumi says the lover must die in the beloved. Buddha says the illusion of the experiencer must be seen through. Different ontologies, different truth claims about reality, but both discovered. Whatever ultimate reality is, whether you call it God, emptiness, dharmakaya, or refuse to name it, the ordinary ego self is not it. Liberation requires the dissolution of that ego construct. The Sufi dissolves through love, the Buddhist through insight. Rumi experienced something and interpreted it through Islamic mysticism. Buddha experienced something and interpreted it through dependent origination. The experiences converge, the interpretations diverge. Both might be pointing at something that exceeds language entirely, which is exactly why both traditions turned away from philosophy and toward poetry, paradox, practices that bypass conceptual mind altogether. Ask a Sufi master, what is Fana? He might respond with Rumi, silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation. Ask a Zen master, what is Buddha nature? He might respond, 3 pounds of flax or the cypress tree in the garden. Both answers sound absurd, both are perfect. The Kalama Sutta records the Buddha visiting the Kalama, a clan confused by competing teachers. They ask, how do we know which teaching is true? The Buddha, do not go upon what has been acquired by repeated hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon scripture, nor upon surmise, nor upon inference. Instead, when you know for yourselves these things are unwholesome, lead to harm and suffering, then abandon them. Test through direct experience, know for yourself. The Kulamalunkyā Sutta lists questions the Buddha refused to answer. Is the world eternal or not eternal? Finite or infinite? Does the Tathagata exist after death? Why refuse? The Buddha explains with parable. You've been shot with a poisoned arrow. Do you demand to know who shot it? What family they're from? What wood the arrow is made from? Or do you remove the arrow? These metaphysical questions don't lead to disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, peace, direct knowledge, enlightenment, nibbāna. The Udana contains one of Buddhism's most paradoxical statements. There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, If there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, no escape from the born, become, made, conditioned would be discernible. What is this unborn, unconditioned? The Buddha doesn't say, can't say, points to it, doesn't define it. Zen masters weaponized paradox. Koans designed to break conceptual mind. Zen koans like these aren't riddles with clever answers. They're cognitive traps designed to exhaust the logical mind until it collapses. The logical mind tries to solve them, exhausts itself, collapses, and in that collapse, insight can emerge. Zen Master Dogen. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. Rumi's Masnavi, 25,000 couplet, called the Quran in Persian by some scholars, but it's not systematic theology. Stories within stories, metaphors that contradict each other, paradoxes refusing resolution, poetry bypassing rational mind. Rumi. You think because you understand one, you must also understand two, because one and one makes two. But you must also understand and. What does and mean? The connection, the relationship, the space between. That which isn't captured in quantities. Rumi explained, conventional opinion is the ruin of our souls. Something within us can be awakened only by poetry. Poetry works through rhythm, which entrains consciousness, metaphor, which points without defining, emotion, which speaks to heart, not intellect, ambiguity, which holds multiple truths simultaneously. Both traditions ultimately point to silence, but they mean different things. Sufi silence, intimacy with the beloved. When love becomes so complete, words become obstacles. Rumi. There is a voice that doesn't use words. Listen. In deepest dhikr practice, even remembrance becomes silent. The heart remembers without words. Zen silence. Collapse of conceptual mind. When dualistic thinking ceases, what would you say? To whom? About what? The distinction between speaker and listener, between subject and object, has dissolved. Those who know don't speak, those who speak don't know. Both discovered ultimate reality, whether you call it Allah, Dharmakaya, Shunyata, or nothing, cannot be captured in concepts. Why? Because language operates through subject-object duality, and the enlightened state is non-dual. How do you describe the taste of water to someone who's never drunk anything? You can't. You can only point. There's the well, drink. The Buddha. When you realize the nature of the five aggregates as impermanent, suffering, and not self, you abandon desire for them. With the fading away of that desire, you are liberated. Translation, through seeing what you are not, you discover freedom. Loss of illusion is gain of truth. Both refuse to resolve the paradox. The unresolved tension is the teaching. Contemporary seekers want clear answers, 5 steps to enlightenment, a guarantee, a map with precise coordinates. Buddhism and Sufism both say, if you can understand it intellectually, you haven't understood it. The Buddha in the Alagādhapāma Sutta. I have taught the Dhamma like a raft, for the purpose of crossing over, not for grasping. Rumi. Sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment. Cleverness is mere opinion. Bewilderment brings intuitive knowledge. True knowing requires the death of the knower, which is why both traditions use practices. Meditation, dhikr, and provocations, koans, poetry, to induce direct experience. But paradox leads to another question entirely. 638 CE. Islamic armies sweep through Persia, Afghanistan, Central Asia. In these newly conquered lands, they encounter something unexpected. Buddhist monasteries, meditation techniques, monks claiming self is illusion, and liberation comes through direct perception. Within 2 centuries, Sufism emerges in these exact regions. Place them on a timeline. The Buddha in 5th century BCE India, Rumi in 13th century Anatolia. 2 peaks of human consciousness on opposite sides of history. Did one influence the other, or did they independently discover the same truths? The geographic overlap is undeniable. Sufism's earliest development, Khorasan, modern Afghanistan and eastern Iran, Transoxiana, Central Asia. These were Buddhist strongholds for centuries before Islam arrived. The Bamiyan Buddhas, those massive statues destroyed by Taliban in 2001, stood in Afghanistan for over 1,000 years. Buddhist universities at Balkh, Bamiyan throughout the region. When Muslim scholars arrived, this was the intellectual landscape they encountered. Timeline alignment. Islam reaches these regions 7th century CE. Sufism emerges as distinct movement, 8th to 9th centuries. Organized Sufi orders develop 10th to 13th centuries. Right place, right time. Powerful early Muslim families like the Barmakids came from Buddhist backgrounds. Along the Silk Road, Sufis and Buddhists lived side by side. Ideas were inevitably traded, even if we can't trace exact footnotes. The parallels run deep. Practices, terminology, even the metaphors. Fire, extinction, annihilation. Some scholars see clear transmission, others see independent discovery. But other scholars push back hard. The Quran contains mystical elements Sufis draw from. Surah 50:16. We are closer to him than his jugular vein. Surah 2, 115. Wherever you turn, there is the face of God. The Prophet Muhammad's night journey, Isra and Miraj, mystical ascension. Early Sufis like Hassan al-Basri, 642 to 728 CE, were deeply rooted in Quranic exegesis and hadith, not importing foreign ideas, exploring the inner dimension of their own revelation. Jewish Kabbalah developed similar concepts, Ein Sof, Devakut, with no Buddhist contact. Christian mystics, Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, described ego death and divine union. No Buddhist influence. Maybe humans pushed to contemplative extremes independently discover similar features of consciousness. No early Sufi texts explicitly cite Buddhist sources. No manuscripts showing direct translation of Buddhist meditation manuals. The connections are suggestive, but not definitive. Maybe they're right, or maybe the truth threatens something. The idea that truth can be discovered independently, that no tradition has a monopoly on insight, that human consciousness pushed to its limits reveals the same patterns everywhere. The Buddha himself didn't invent meditation. He studied under Alara Kalama, who taught the 7th jhana, and Udaka Ramaputa, who taught the 8th jhana. The Buddha learned their techniques, mastered them, then went further. He didn't reject their methods, he incorporated and transcended them. If Sufis encountered Buddhist practices and adapted them into Islamic framework, they'd be doing exactly what the Buddha did. Rumi explicitly embraced universalism. I belong to no religion. My religion is love. Every heart is my temple. Christian, Jew, Muslim, shaman, Zoroastrian, stone, ground, mountain, river, each has a secret way of being with the mystery. For Rumi, the source mattered less than the validity. What matters more than proving influence, whether Sufism learned from Buddhism or developed independently? Both traditions discovered convergent insights about consciousness, ego, suffering, liberation. This tells us something profound. These aren't culturally specific truths. They're discoveries about the structure of human consciousness itself. Cultures independently discovered fire, agriculture, mathematics. Contemplative traditions independently discovered the constructed nature of self, the possibility of ego dissolution, the liberation that follows. Whether Buddhism influenced Sufism or not, scholars will debate for decades. But there's one thing we know with certainty. Right now in 2025, both paths remain open. The techniques still work. The transformations still happen. The historical question is fascinating, but the personal question is urgent. What does any of this mean for you? You live in a world where neuroscience can map brain states during meditation. Psychedelics can temporarily dissolve ego boundaries. AI can generate spiritual-sounding wisdom on command. So why does any of this, a 13th century Persian mystic and a 5th century BCE Indian monk, still matter? Because neither technology nor concepts can do what Rumi and the Buddha discovered you must do yourself. Buddhism offers a systematic, non-theistic path to understanding suffering and its cessation. Paticcasamuppada as framework for seeing how suffering arises. Liberation that doesn't require belief in God, afterlife, or metaphysical claims. Practical meditation techniques tested over 2,500 years. Can be practiced alongside or without religious framework. Sufism offers a devotional, heart-centered path that transforms suffering through love. Ishq as both method and goal. Poetry and music as contemplative technologies. Community taraka as support structure. Transformation through relationship with teacher, with divine, with tradition. The Sufi recognizes you can't think your way to God, you must love your way there. You don't have to choose between these paths, you can learn from both. From Buddhism, discipline of daily meditation. Investigation of who am I through examining 5 aggregates. Recognition of impermanence in every experience. Cultivation of equanimity. From Sufism, power of devotional practice, transformation available through surrender. Role of beauty, poetry, music in awakening. Dissolution of ego through love. Pure Land Buddhism adds interesting dimension here. If you've seen our video on Pure Land, you know this Mahayana school emphasizes devotion to Amitabha Buddha, remarkably similar to Sufi devotional practice, reciting Namo Amitabha Buddha thousands of times, almost identical to dhikr. Not identical theologically, but the devotional mechanism shows striking parallels. The Fire Sermon, Buddha's third discourse, connects directly to our theme. The Buddha told a gathering of fire worshippers, everything is burning, the I is burning, forms are burning, I consciousness is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of greed, hatred, delusion, with birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation. Seeing this, becoming dispassionate, one is liberated. Notice, the Buddha uses their metaphor, fire, to teach extinguishing, the same way we're using Rumi's language, annihilation, love, union, to illuminate Buddhist insights about not self. You can buy a $500 meditation cushion, download 47 apps, read Rumi on Instagram, collect it all like spiritual Pokemon and never change at all, because accumulation is the opposite of liberation. Rumi and Buddha didn't collect practices, they did one practice, completely, until it destroyed them, until the collector itself dissolved. Sufism warns, without guidance the seeker gets lost in emotional ecstasy. Buddhism warns, without discipline the meditator gets trapped in spiritual pride. Both recognize danger in the path itself. In 2025, you can read 10,000 books on enlightenment, watch 10,000 videos on meditation, debate metaphysics endlessly online. Or you can do what Rumi and the Buddha both insisted on: actually practice. Sit in meditation like the Buddha taught. Observe breath, body, feelings, mind. See impermanence directly. Investigate the 5 aggregates until you can't find self anywhere. Or practice dhikr like Rumi suggested. Repeat the divine name until the speaker dissolves. Surrender completely. Love until there's only love left. No lover. Different paths, both require you to actually walk them. So where does this leave us? And then, centuries later, the world watched another kind of liberation. December 17th, 1273, Rumi's funeral in Konya. The streets fill with mourners, Muslims, obviously, but also Christians, Jews, Hindus, even Buddhists, according to some accounts. They all came, they all claimed him, because Rumi's poetry spoke to something deeper than doctrine, deeper than theology, deeper than cultural identity. He spoke to the universal human yearning for liberation from the prison of self. Around 483 BCE, the Buddha passes into final nibbāna at Kusinara. Disciples gather, monks and laypeople, Brahmins and outcasts, gods and humans according to the texts. The Dhamma he taught would spread across Asia, adapting to every culture it touched. Theravada in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, Mahayana in East Asia, Vajrayana in Tibet and Mongolia. Each tradition emphasizes different aspects, each develops unique practices. But the core insight remains. Suffering arises from clinging to what is impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self. Liberation comes through seeing this directly. 2 men, 2 paths, 2 metaphysical frameworks making incompatible truth claims. One said, "There is only God. Love him until you disappear into him." The other said, "There is only dependent origination. See through the illusion of self." One worshiped the divine absolutely. The other questioned the God's authority completely. Still, when ego dissolves through Fana, the labels Sufi and Muslim dissolve with it. When anattā is directly perceived, the labels Buddhist and practitioner reveal themselves as empty constructions. When the drop merges with the ocean, it doesn't matter which shore it started from. When the flame of self goes out, it doesn't matter what fuel fed it. We haven't proven these traditions teach the same thing. They don't. Buddhism and Sufism make different claims about the existence of God, the nature of ultimate reality, the structure of the cosmos, but they describe strikingly convergent experiences: ego death, non-dual awareness, collapse of subject-object duality, liberation from suffering, peace beyond description. This tells us something profound, not that all truths are the same, but that the human mind, when pushed to contemplative extremes, reveals patterns that transcend culture. Rumi, don't grieve. Anything you lose comes round in another form. The Buddha, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Loss and impermanence, both saw it, both embraced it, both found liberation within it. You might identify as Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, atheist, or something else entirely. Rumi and the Buddha suggest the path you choose matters less than the sincerity with which you walk it. You can dissolve ego through love. You can dissolve it through insight. You can dissolve it through surrender. You can dissolve it through investigation. Rumi, die before you die, and you will not die when you die. The Buddha, they who have defeated themselves live happily. Victory and defeat mean nothing to them. 2 traditions, 1 human condition, suffering born of clinging to a constructed self. Multiple paths toward liberation, the dissolution of that construct. Not because all paths are the same, but because consciousness, when freed from illusion, reveals something existing before and beyond all concepts, all labels, all traditions. Rumi called it Allah. The Buddha refused to name it, calling it only the unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned. Two different fingers pointing at the same moon, or perhaps more accurately, two different rivers both flowing into one vast ocean. Neither Rumi nor the Buddha asked you to believe them. Both insisted. Test it, practice it, experience it yourself, because no amount of videos, books, or intellectual understanding can substitute for direct realization. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. The map is not the territory. The concept of water doesn't quench thirst. You have to drink. If this exploration challenged how you think about enlightenment across traditions, dive deeper into the Buddhist foundations we discussed. Check out our videos on Dependent Origination Explained, the Self versus No Self, Jung and Buddha's Greatest Debate, and Pure Land Buddhism, the Buddhist multiverse you were never taught. All linked in the description. Subscribe if you want more comparative philosophy that takes these traditions seriously, not to flatten their differences, but to understand what humans across cultures have discovered about consciousness, suffering, liberation. Hit the notification bell. Leave a comment. Which mystical tradition should we explore next? Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, Jewish Kabbalah, Hindu Advaita Vedanta, the Taoists. Until next time, stay curious, stay wise. And as Rumi and the Buddha might both say, keep walking.